Sometimes the hardest thing in life is starting over when everyone has already decided you've failed. Darren knew that feeling all too well. A man with nothing left. He bought the one house nobody wanted, a rotting shell at the edge of town that people said was cursed. He didn't care what they thought. He had his dog Rusty, and that was enough. So he fixed broken walls and ignored the whispers. Then one night, Rusty started barking at the basement door and wouldn't stop. Darren opened it and found a hidden room filled with evidence of old crimes the town wanted forgotten, and someone knew he'd found it. What secret was worth killing for? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. 3 weeks earlier, Darren had arrived in Ridgewood with everything he owned packed into the bed of a dusty pickup truck. The town sat in a valley between low rolling hills, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers were noticed immediately. He'd driven through the main street slowly, taking in the hardware store, the diner with its faded red awning, the post office that doubled as a general store. People on the sidewalk had paused to watch him pass, their expressions a mix of curiosity and something else, wariness. Perhaps Rusty had sat in the passenger seat, his head out the window, tongue lolling in the autumn breeze. The German Shepherd mix had been Darren's constant companion for 7 years, through the good times and the hard fall that followed. When everything else had slipped away, the marriage, the business, the respect he'd worked decades to build, Rusty had remained, loyal, uncomplicated, honest in a way people rarely were. The house sat at the eastern edge of town, where the paved road gave way to gravel, and the nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile down the road. Darren had seen the listing online. Victorian-era structure, needs work, price to sell. The photographs hadn't done justice to how much work it actually needed. The porch sagged in the middle, its boards grey and splintered. Paint peeled from the siding in long, curling strips, revealing wood gone soft with rot in places. Several windows were cracked, one covered with plywood. The yard was a tangle of weeds and overgrown shrubs that pressed against the foundation. But the bones were good. Darren could see that immediately. Solid stone foundation, most of the roof intact despite missing shingles, the basic structure sound beneath the neglect. He'd spent 30 years as a contractor before his business collapsed, and he knew the difference between a house that was dying and one that was merely sleeping. This one could be saved. The real estate agent had met him there, a nervous woman in her 50s who'd kept glancing at her watch as though she had somewhere else to be. She'd handed him the keys with barely concealed relief and hadn't asked questions when he'd paid cash from what remained of his savings after the divorce settlement and business debts. The paperwork had been simple. No inspection, he'd waived it. No mortgage, couldn't qualify for one anyway, not with his credit in ruins. "You're sure about this?" the agent had asked, hesitating by her car. "The house has a history. People don't tend to stay long, I'm sure," Darren had replied, and meant it. He had nowhere else to go. That first night, he'd slept on an air mattress in what had once been the living room, with Rusty curled up beside him. The house had made sounds, creaks and groans as old houses do, the whistle of wind through gaps in the walls, the scuttle of small creatures in the spaces between floors. He'd lain awake listening, not afraid exactly, but aware that he'd committed himself to something larger than just a renovation project. This house would demand everything he had left to give. The days had fallen into a rhythm. He woke with the sun, made coffee on a camp stove until he could get the kitchen functional, and worked until his muscles ached. Rusty explored the property, marking his territory, occasionally bringing treasures, old bones, rusted tools. Once a child's toy truck so corroded it crumbled in Darren's hands. The town had watched from a distance. When he'd walked into Vernon's Hardware on his 3rd day, conversation had died. The man behind the counter, Vernon himself, grizzled and solid as an oak stump, had served him without comment beyond the transaction itself. Others in the store had studied him openly, not bothering to hide their curiosity. It was at Beatrice's diner that he'd gotten his first real taste of how the town viewed his purchase. He'd gone in for breakfast on the Saturday morning of his second week, hungry for something besides the canned soup and crackers he'd been living on. The diner was busy, locals filling the booths and counter stools. An older woman with steel-grey hair pulled back in a neat bun had approached with coffee. "You're the one who bought the Pritchard place," she'd said. "Not a question. That's right, Darren." He'd offered his hand. She'd shaken it briefly. "Beatrice, I own this place." Her eyes had assessed him carefully. "That house has been empty more than occupied these last 40 years. So I've heard. People say it's cursed." She'd poured his coffee with practiced ease. "Lost 3 owners in 20 years before it sat vacant for good. Each one left sudden-like. Never could keep anyone." Darren had sipped the coffee, strong and bitter the way he liked it. "I don't believe in curses. Maybe not. But facts are facts." She'd glanced around the diner, lowering her voice. "You seem like a decent man. Just be careful. That house has a way of bringing trouble." He'd ordered eggs and toast, and she'd walked away without another word. The meal had been good, the portions generous, but he'd felt eyes on him the entire time. Conversations around him had been muted, careful. He was an outsider in a place where outsiders were marked. At the hardware store, Vernon had warmed to him slightly after that first visit, enough to offer advice on the best sealant for the foundation, or which lumberyard in the next town over gave fair prices. But there was always a guardedness, a sense that Vernon was measuring each word before speaking it. Sheriff Briggs had stopped by the house during Darren's 3rd week. A tall man with grey threading through dark hair, wearing a uniform that was crisp despite the rural setting. He'd introduced himself cordially enough, explained he liked to know who was living in his jurisdiction. "Everything all right out here?" Briggs had asked, his gaze taking in the work Darren had done. New boards on the porch, windows cleaned, debris cleared from the yard. "Fine, just fixing the place up. Good to see someone taking care of it." Briggs had paused as though weighing his next words. "You hear anything odd? See anything that concerns you? You give me a call." He'd handed over a business card. "Is there something I should be concerned about?" The sheriff had smiled, but it hadn't reached his eyes. "Just want you to know we look after folks, even newcomers." After Briggs had left, Darren had stood on the porch, card in hand, wondering what that exchange had really been about. A friendly welcome or a subtle warning? The house itself had revealed its secrets slowly. Beneath the grime and neglect, there was craftsmanship. Hand-carved molding, built-in shelves, a stone fireplace that just needed cleaning. He'd worked methodically, room by room, stripping away the decay to find what remained sound underneath. It was therapeutic work, physical labor that kept his mind from dwelling too much on what he'd lost. His ex-wife had remarried already, according to the last email he'd received from his lawyer. His former business partner had opened a new company with money that should have been split between them, but the bankruptcy had been too complicated, the lawyers too expensive to fight. The storm came on a Tuesday evening, rolling in from the west, with the kind of speed that made Darren check the windows twice. Dark clouds churned across the sky, turning afternoon into premature dusk. He'd been working on the kitchen when the first drops hit, fat and heavy against the roof. Rusty had been acting strange all day. The dog had paced from room to room, whining occasionally, his attention fixated on the basement door in the hallway. Darren had tried to settle him with treats and reassurance, but nothing worked. The German. Shepard kept returning to that door, sniffing at the gap beneath it, his tail rigid. "What's gotten into you, boy?" Darren had asked, crouching beside him. Rusty had looked at him with those intelligent brown eyes, then back at the door and barked. A sharp, insistent sound. The storm intensified. Wind rattled the windows in there. Flames and thunder rumbled so close that Darren felt it in his chest. The lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. He'd lived through enough storms to know this one was going to be rough. He made sure his flashlight was nearby and checked that the windows were secure. But Rusty wouldn't settle. The dog's agitation grew with the storm, and finally he began barking at the basement door in earnest, deep, urgent barks that spoke of alarm rather than mere curiosity. His claws scraped at the wood, leaving fresh marks beside the old ones Darren had noticed weeks ago. All right, Darren said, more to himself than the dog. He'd been putting off a thorough basement inspection, telling himself he'd get to it once the main floor was habitable. The space below was damp and uninviting, and he'd seen enough on his initial survey to know it would be a major project. But Rusty's behavior was impossible to ignore. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and a crowbar from his toolbox, the crowbar, just in case he needed to pry open a stuck door or move debris. The basement door opened with a groan of old hinges. A rush of cold, damp air hit him, carrying a smell he couldn't quite place. Metallic, earthy, wrong. Rusty bounded down the stairs before Darren could stop him, his barking echoing off stone walls. Darren followed more carefully, testing each step. The wooden stairs were old but solid, though they creaked under his weight. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same space he'd seen on his first visit. Stone foundation, walls slick with moisture, an ancient furnace squatting in one corner, standing water in the low spots of the concrete floor. The storm raged above them. Thunder shook the house and rain hammered against the small ground-level windows. But down here, the sound was muffled, distant, as though the basement existed separate from the world above. Rusty had stopped at the far wall, where the shadows were deepest. He was digging at the base of the wall, his paws sending up sprays of dirt and loose mortar. The barking had changed to a continuous, anxious whine. "Rusty, stop that!" Darren approached, shining his light on the wall. At first, he saw only the same stone and brick he'd expect in a basement this old. But as he examined it more closely, something caught his eye. The mortar in one section looked different, lighter in color, less weathered than the surrounding areas. And when he ran his hand across the surface, he felt it, a gap, barely visible, where the wall didn't quite meet true. He knocked on the stone with his knuckles. The sound was hollow. His contractor's instincts kicked in. This wasn't right. Walls didn't sound hollow unless there was space behind them. He moved along the section, knocking at intervals, mapping out an area roughly 6 feet wide and 7 feet tall, where the sound remained hollow. Someone had built a false wall here, or sealed off part of the basement. The question was why. Darren fetched the crowbar and began working at the edges where the newer mortar met the old. It crumbled more easily than he'd expected, falling away in chunks. Behind the brick facing, he found wooden boards, old but solid, nailed in place decades ago by the look of the rusted nail heads. His heart beat faster as he worked. This was deliberate. Someone had gone to considerable effort to hide whatever lay behind this wall. The storm raged on above, but he barely noticed now. He pried away board after board, creating an opening large enough to shine his light through. The beam revealed a small space beyond, a hidden room, perhaps 8 feet by 8 feet. The air that escaped was stale and cold, untouched for years. Darren widened the opening until he could step through. Inside, the flashlight illuminated a scene frozen in time. A metal filing cabinet stood against one wall, its surface covered in dust, so thick it looked like grey felt. Cardboard boxes were stacked in one corner, their sides bulging and water-stained. Old tools hung on hooks, a shovel, a pickaxe, a sledgehammer, their handles dark with age and something else, stains that looked rust-brown in the harsh light. But it was the filing cabinet that drew his attention. He pulled open the top drawer, which resisted for a moment before sliding free with a screech of metal on metal. Inside were hanging folders, dozens of them, their tabs labeled in neat handwriting. He pulled one out at random. Newspaper clippings fell into his hands. The paper was yellowed and brittle, but the headlines were still legible. Local man reported missing. Search continues for transient worker. Police seek information on disappearance. The dates spanned from 1972 to 1978. 6 years of clippings, all documenting people who had vanished from Ridgewood and the surrounding area. Darren's hands trembled slightly as he opened another folder. This one contained photographs, black and white images of men standing in groups, some formal portraits, others candid shots. He recognized the house in the background of several photos. His house. A third folder held what appeared to be a ledger, handwritten. Entries in columns, dates and initials and amounts of money. The entries were cryptic, but patterns emerged. Large sums changing hands, dates that corresponded to the newspaper clippings. Initials he didn't recognize, but some of the full names written in margins made his blood run cold. Wolf, Nash, Kane. Those were names he'd heard in town. Mayor Wolf, Police Chief Nash, and Kane. He'd seen that name on a memorial plaque outside the sheriff's office, honoring a former sheriff who died in the line of duty. Darren was so absorbed in the documents that he almost didn't hear it, the creak of floorboards above his head. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, moving through the first floor of the house. He froze, listening. Rusty heard it too. The dog's head snapped up, his ears forward, and a growl rumbled deep in his chest. Someone was in the house. The storm would have covered the sound of a door opening, of someone entering while Darren was in the basement. His truck was parked out front. Anyone could see he was home. And now they were upstairs, and he was trapped down here with evidence of something he didn't fully understand yet, but knew instinctively was dangerous. Darren's pulse hammered in his ears. He grabbed the heavy wrench from among the tools on the wall. It was solid metal, weighted well for swinging if it came to that. Rusty was already moving toward the stairs, his growl intensifying. "Easy, boy," Darren whispered, but his own muscles were coiled tight, ready. Darren moved quickly but quietly up the basement stairs, wrench gripped tight in one hand, flashlight in the other. Rusty stayed close, the hackles raised along his spine. Each step seemed impossibly loud despite the storm's fury outside. When they reached the top, Darren eased the door open and peered into the hallway, empty. The lights were still on, casting familiar shadows. But something was different, a presence, a disturbance in the air. He moved into the hallway, checking each room systematically. Kitchen clear, living room clear, the bedroom he'd been using also clear. Then he saw it. The back door, the one that led to the overgrown yard, stood open. Wind drove rain across the threshold, pooling on the floor. Darren approached cautiously, looked outside. Nothing but darkness and the storm. Whoever had been there was gone. He closed and locked the door, checked it twice, then wedged a chair under the handle for good measure. His heart was still racing. Someone had come into his house while he was in the basement. They'd walked through his space, maybe looking for something, maybe just checking to see what he was doing. Either way, it was a violation and a warning. Rusty sniffed around the door and the wet footprints that led from it, his nose working overtime. Darren could see the prints clearly now, boot treads, size 11 or 12, the marks of someone who'd stood just inside the door for several seconds before leaving. Sleep was impossible that night. After the storm passed and silence settled over the house, Darren went back down to the basement with his phone. He photographed everything, the hidden room, the filing cabinet, each folder's contents, the ledger pages with their cryptic entries. The photographs of men gathered in groups, some smiling, others serious. The newspaper clippings that documented 6 years of disappearances. As he worked, patterns emerged. The ledger was clearly an accounting of some kind. Money changing hands, recorded with the care of someone who needed to keep track. The initials appeared over and over, PW, TN, AK, LP, beside them in parentheses. Dates and amounts. Some entries had notes. Delivery complete, package secured, transfer arranged. The newspaper clippings told a darker story. 6 people had disappeared from the area between 1972 and 1978. All of them were outsiders, transient workers, drifters, people passing through who wouldn't be missed immediately. The police investigations had been minimal, the articles brief. After a week or two, the coverage would stop entirely and the missing would be forgotten. But someone had kept these clippings. Someone had documented each disappearance carefully, filing them away with the ledger entries that seemed to correspond to the dates. Darren felt sick as he recognized the pattern. Whatever had happened to those people, it had been deliberate. and profitable, judging by the amounts of money involved. The final entries in the ledger were dated October 1978. After that, nothing. The records simply stopped, as though whatever operation these documents tracked had ended abruptly. By the time grey dawn light filtered through the basement windows, Darren had photographed everything twice and made notes on his phone. He climbed the stairs exhausted but wired, his mind churning through possibilities. He needed to understand what he'd found. More importantly, he needed to decide what to do about it. Going to the police was the obvious answer. But Sheriff Briggs's name wasn't in the ledger. Kane was. The memorial plaque outside the sheriff's office honored Augustus Kane, who'd served as sheriff from 1968 until his death in 1979. If Kane had been part of whatever conspiracy these documents revealed, could Darren trust the current sheriff? Could he trust anyone in this town? He made coffee and sat at the kitchen table as the sun rose, Rusty lying at his feet. The dog was exhausted too and slept heavily. Darren envied him. His own thoughts wouldn't settle. Someone knew he'd found the hidden room. That's why they'd come during the storm. They'd wanted to see what he was doing, or maybe to scare him off. Either way, he was marked now. Whatever secrets that basement held, someone was willing to break into his house to protect them. The library opened at 9. Darren decided that was his next step. If these documents were legitimate, and every instinct told him they were, then there should be corroborating evidence in the public record. Newspaper archives, property records, anything that might help him understand the full picture. He showered and changed clothes, then drove into town. The storm had left the streets clean and puddles standing in every low spot. Morning sun broke through thinning clouds, making everything sparkle. It would have been beautiful if Darren's stomach wasn't twisted with tension. Beatrice's diner was busy with the breakfast crowd. Darren stopped for coffee and food. He needed fuel, and he needed to appear normal. But Beatrice noticed immediately. She brought the coffee pot to his table and studied his face. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, pouring the dark liquid. "Long night. Storm kept me up." The lie came easily, but he could see she didn't quite believe it. That old house must be unsettling in weather like that. She glanced around the diner, then lowered her voice. "You finding what you need out there? Everything all right?" The question felt loaded with meaning. Darren met her eyes. "I'm managing, just trying to make the place livable," she nodded slowly. "You need anything at all, you come find me. I've been in this town a long time. I know things." Before he could respond, she'd moved on to another table, but her words stayed with him. "I know things." Was that an offer of help or something else? The library was a small brick building 2 blocks off Main Street. Inside, it smelled of old books and furniture polish. The librarian sat at the front desk, a woman in her 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun and sharp eyes behind reading glasses. "Help you?" she asked. "I'd like to look at old newspapers, if that's possible. On microfiche, or however they're stored. We've got microfiche for the Ridgewood Gazette going back to 1950. What years are you interested in?" 1972 through 78. Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. "That's a specific range. Research project?" "Something like that. I bought the old Pritchard house, and I'm curious about its history. Thought I'd learn about the area during those years." The Pritchard place. She stood slowly, her joints clearly stiff. "That house has quite a history. Come with me." She led him to a back room where an old microfiche reader sat on a table surrounded by filing cabinets. She pulled out several boxes of film, each labeled with years and months. "These cover what you're looking for. Machines simple to operate. Instructions are right there. You make copies with this button, 10 cents a page." She paused at the door. "I'm Mrs. Pembroke. Been librarian here 42 years. Seen a lot of people come through asking a lot of questions. I appreciate your help, Mrs. Pembroke. Word of advice, young man. Some history is better left buried. People have their reasons for forgetting things." Her gaze was steady, not unkind but serious. "You seem like a decent person. Be careful what you dig up." Then she was gone, leaving Darren alone with decades of history waiting to be examined. He started with 1972 and worked forward chronologically. The Ridgewood Gazette was a small-town paper, mostly local news, school events, county fair results. But interspersed were the articles he'd seen in the basement, reports of missing persons. The first disappearance was in March 1972. A man named Joseph Garrett, age 34, last seen at a bar on Route 9. The initial article expressed concern. A follow-up a week later noted that police had no leads. After that, nothing. The pattern repeated. Every few months, another disappearance. Another brief investigation. Another trail gone cold. The articles were remarkably similar in tone, factual, detached, almost dismissive, as though the missing people weren't worth sustained attention. But what struck Darren most was what appeared between these articles. Photos of town events, a ribbon-cutting ceremony for a new town hall. The mayor, Preston Wolfe Sr., according to the caption, beaming beside other officials. A police commendation ceremony where Sheriff Augustus Kane received an award. A business association meeting where local leaders posed for a group photo. And there in those photos were faces he'd seen in the basement documents. Younger versions, but unmistakable. The men in the hidden room's photographs were the same men running Ridgewood in the 1970s. Darren returned home in the early afternoon with copies of the most relevant articles tucked into a folder. The house felt different now, not quite his own anymore. Someone had walked through it uninvited, and that violation lingered in the air like a scent he couldn't wash away. Rusty greeted him at the door with his usual enthusiasm, but within minutes the dog's demeanor changed. He began circling through the rooms, nose to the ground, sniffing intently. When he reached the bedroom, he stopped and stared at the dresser. Darren approached and immediately saw what had caught the dog's attention. His clothes were slightly disarranged. Nothing obvious. The drawers were still closed. Everything appeared in place. But Darren was meticulous about his few possessions, and he could see that someone had opened these drawers and gone through them. A shirt he'd folded was now bunched. Socks were out of order. Small things, but unmistakable. They'd come back. While he was at the library, someone had been in the house again. His jaw tightened as he checked the rest of the rooms. The same subtle disturbances everywhere. Books on the shelf shifted, papers on the table moved, and not quite returned to their original positions. Whoever was doing this wanted him to know. They weren't even trying to hide their intrusion. It was a message: we can get in whenever we want. You have no privacy, no safety. Anger pushed through the fear. Darren had spent the last 2 years feeling powerless, watching his marriage collapse, his business fail, his reputation dissolve. He'd come here to start over, to reclaim some sense of control over his own life. And now strangers were walking through his house, going through his things, trying to intimidate him. He wasn't going to run. Not this time. Darren spent the afternoon installing better security. He drove to the hardware store in the next town over. He didn't want to give Vernon any hint of what he was doing. He bought deadbolts, window locks, a battery-powered motion sensor for the driveway. Nothing sophisticated, but enough to give him warning and make entry more difficult. As he worked, he reviewed the photographs from the basement on his phone, comparing them to the newspaper clippings he'd copied. One photograph in particular drew his attention. 5 men stood in front of his house. This house, though it had looked much better maintained in the 1970s, they were dressed casually, some with rolled-up sleeves, and they looked relaxed. Friends gathering for a weekend afternoon, perhaps. Except Darren now recognized 4 of them from the newspaper photos. The man on the far left was young Preston Wolfe Sr. The caption in one of the news articles had identified him. Businessman, town council member in the 70s, later mayor. The man next to him was Theodore Nash Sr., who, according to another article, had been the police chief before retiring in 1985. And there, third from the left, was Sheriff Augustus Kane. Younger than in his official portrait, but unmistakable. The 4th man Darren didn't recognize immediately, but the 5th he did. Lawrence Pritchard, the man who'd owned this house from 1972 to 1978, according to property records. The man who'd supposedly left town suddenly when his business failed. Darren studied Pritchard's face. He looked like an ordinary man, trim build, average height, dark hair starting to thin. His smile in the photograph seemed genuine, his posture comfortable among these other men. Whatever had happened here, Pritchard had been part of it, had been central to it, given that the evidence was hidden in his house. By evening, Darren had installed all the new locks and the motion sensor. He tested everything twice. It wouldn't stop a determined intruder, but it would slow them down and alert him. He also took all the photographs and documents he'd found and stored them in multiple locations, some in his truck, some hidden in the rafters of the detached garage, some uploaded to a cloud storage account he created just for this purpose. If something happened to him, the evidence would survive. That thought should have been paranoid. Instead, it felt prudent. Around 7 o'clock, as dusk settled over Ridgewood, Darren made a decision. He needed to test the waters to see how the town would react if he started asking questions. Vernon at the hardware store seemed like a reasonable place to start. The man had been marginally friendly, and his name wasn't in the ledger. The hardware store was nearly empty when Darren arrived, just Vernon behind the counter reading a farming catalogue. The older man looked up and nodded in greeting. "Evening? Forget something?" "No, I'm good." Darren approached the counter, trying to appear casual. "Actually, I had a question. Been doing some work in the basement and found some old things left behind. Newspapers, photographs. Made me curious about the previous owner." "Lawrence Pritchard. Did you know him?" Vernon's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the catalogue. A muscle worked in his jaw. "That was a long time ago." "I know. Just curious about the house's history. Seems like he left pretty suddenly. People leave towns for all sorts of reasons." Vernon's voice had gone flat, careful. "Business fails. Life doesn't work out the way you planned. Pritchard had some troubles, decided to move on. Happens. Did you know him personally?" Now Vernon met his eyes directly. "I knew him, not well. Kept to himself mostly." He paused, then added, "Look, Darren, you seem like a good guy. You're working hard on that place, keeping your head down. That's smart. Houses have history, sure, but dwelling on it doesn't help anybody. Best to focus on the present, on making the place yours. I'm just trying to understand what I bought. You bought a house that needs work. The past doesn't matter. What matters is what you do with it now." Vernon closed the catalogue deliberately. "Was there anything else you needed?" The dismissal was clear. Darren shook his head and left, but not before noticing Vernon reach for his phone the moment the door closed. Through the window, Darren could see the older man's mouth moving, animated now in a way it hadn't been during their conversation. News of his questions would spread. That had been the point, to see how the town reacted. Now he'd know. He drove home as darkness fell completely, his mind working through the implications. Vernon's reaction had been revealing. Not hostile, but guarded, concerned, the way someone acts when they're protecting something, or when they're afraid. The motion sensor he'd installed at the end of his driveway triggered as he pulled in, its small red light blinking. Good, it worked. He parked and went inside, Rusty greeting him with wagging tail and eager dance. The house was secure. The evidence was backed up. Tomorrow, he'd continue investigating, maybe talk to more people, see what other reactions he could provoke. But tonight, he needed rest. He made a simple dinner, ate while reviewing his notes, and prepared for bed. Rusty settled on the floor beside him as he lay down, the dog's presence comforting. Around midnight, the house phone rang. Darren had set up basic landline service his first week, mainly for emergencies, since cell coverage was spotty out here. The shrill sound cut through the silence, making his heart jump. He grabbed the receiver. "Hello?" Silence on the other end. Not dead air, he could hear breathing, soft and steady. "Who is this?" A pause, then a male voice, calm and measured. "Stop digging into things that don't concern you. Leave town. This is the only warning you'll get." The line went dead before Darren could respond. He sat there in the darkness, phone still pressed to his ear, listening to the dial tone. His hands were steady, but his pulse hammered. They knew. They knew he'd been asking questions, and they knew what he'd found. The break-ins had been reconnaissance. Now came the direct threat. Darren set the phone down slowly. Rusty had risen to his feet, sensing his master's tension. The dog whined softly, pressing against Darren's leg. For a long moment, Darren sat there weighing his options. He could pack up tonight, leave Ridgewood in the rearview mirror, forget he'd ever found that hidden room, go somewhere else and start over again. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice maybe, but he was tired of running, tired of letting other people push him around, tired of being the man who'd lost everything and slunk away in defeat. Whatever had happened in this house, whatever crimes those men had committed 40 years ago, someone needed to answer for it. Those 6 people who disappeared deserved more than forgotten newspaper clippings and closed case files. And Darren deserved to feel like he had some control over his own life again. He wasn't leaving. Morning light found Darren gritty-eyed at the kitchen table, his 3rd cup of coffee growing cold as he stared at the notes spread before him. He'd slept poorly, startling awake at every sound. But the night had passed without incident, and now he needed to decide his next move. The answer arrived at 7:30, slipped under his front door while he was in the shower. He found it when he came downstairs, a plain white envelope, no postage, no return address. His name written on the front in shaky cursive. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting matching the envelope. The message was brief. They're watching. Kane didn't fall. Check plot 247, come alone, no signature, no explanation. Just a cryptic warning and what appeared to be directions to a cemetery plot. Darren read it 3 times, trying to parse the meaning. Kane, that had to be Augustus Kane, the former sheriff whose name appeared in the ledger. The memorial plaque said he died in the line of duty, but this note suggested something else. Kane didn't fall. An accident that wasn't an accident. And someone had risked bringing this to his door. Someone who knew what he was investigating. An ally or a trap? Only one way to find out. Oakwood Cemetery sat on the eastern edge of town, where the land rose in gentle hills covered with old oak trees. Darren had driven past it several times, but never stopped. Now, in the morning stillness, he turned through the iron gates and followed the narrow road that wound through sections marked by decades. The oldest graves dated to the 1800s, their headstones weathered and tilted. Newer sections showed more recent dates, polished granite reflecting the sun. He found plot 247 in a section from the late 1970s, beneath a spreading oak whose leaves rustled in the light breeze. The headstone was simple grey marble. Augustus Kane, beloved husband and father, devoted lawman, 1934-1979. Fresh flowers lay at its base, yellow chrysanthemums, not yet wilted. Someone had been here recently. Darren knelt to examine the stone, looking for anything unusual, any clue about why he'd been directed here. The dates, the inscription, nothing seemed out of place. He was about to stand when he heard footsteps on the grass behind him. You must be Darren. He turned to find an elderly woman approaching, carrying a small gardening tote and a watering can. She was thin and straight-backed despite her age, with silver hair pulled into a bun, and eyes that still held sharpness. She wore practical clothes, khaki pants, a button-up shirt, sturdy shoes. I am. And you are? Phyllis Kane. Augustus was my husband. She gestured at the headstone. I leave the note this morning. Figured if you were serious about digging into the past, you'd come. Darren stood, brushing dirt from his knees. You know what I found. I know that old house has secrets, and I know someone finally bought it who might have the courage to expose them. She set down her tote and regarded him steadily. My husband was an honest man in a town that didn't value honesty. It got him killed. The memorial says he died in the line of duty. The memorial lies. Her voice was matter-of-fact, as though she'd long since processed the grief. They pushed him down the basement stairs of that very house you now own. Made it look like an accident. He'd been investigating the disappearances, found the ledger, brought copies home to show me. Darren's pulse quickened. He found the ledger, the one hidden in my basement. Not hidden, then. It was kept in Lawrence Pritchard's office, bold as brass. Augustus got suspicious when yet another transient went missing, 6th one in as many years. Started looking into it quietly, didn't trust his own department. Discovered Pritchard was running a smuggling operation through that house, using the old mining tunnels. Stolen goods, maybe drugs, who knows what else. Town officials were taking cuts, protecting him. She moved to the grave and adjusted the flowers with practiced care. Augustus confronted them, told them he was taking it to the state police. They came to our house that night, 3 of them, demanded the ledger. Augustus told them he'd already turned it over, that it was too late. She looked up at Darren. He was lying, wanted to buy time, protect us. 3 days later, they called me to say he'd fallen at the Pritchard place. Responding to a disturbance, they said. Went into the basement and missed his footing. You didn't believe it. I knew my husband. He was careful, sure-footed. And why would he go to that house alone, at night, without backup? She shook her head, but I couldn't prove anything. I had a young son to raise, no money, no power. The investigation was handled by the very men I suspected. Death ruled accidental. Case closed. What happened to your son? Left for college when he turned 18, never came back. Can't say I blame him. This town took his father. Her expression softened slightly. He's got his own life now, own family. Better that way. Darren absorbed this, pieces clicking into place. Why are you telling me this now? After all these years? Because I'm 83 years old. What can they take from me anymore? My husband's dead, my son's gone. I've got maybe 5 good years left if I'm lucky. She met his eyes. And because I'm tired of carrying this alone. Tired of watching those men's children walk around town like they own it, built on blood money and lies. She reached into her gardening tote and pulled out a small key on a chain. Augustus didn't turn over all the evidence. He made copies, hid them in a safety deposit box at the First National Bank in Crestview. That's the next town over, about 30 miles. This is the key. She pressed it into Darren's hand. I never had the courage to retrieve what's in there. But maybe you do. Darren closed his fingers around the key. It was warm from her pocket, surprisingly heavy. Why didn't you go to the authorities outside Ridgewood? With what proof? My suspicions? A dead husband and a convenient accident. She shook her head. I was terrified, grief-stricken, alone. And by the time I could think clearly, years had passed. Who would believe me? Who would care about crimes 40 years old? I care. And I think I can prove it. Then be careful. They killed Augustus to keep their secrets. They won't hesitate to do the same to you. She picked up her tote and watering can. The box number is 147. Use my name as authorization. I'll call ahead and give permission. Get what's in there and do what my husband couldn't. Make them answer for it. She started to walk away, then paused and looked back. Augustus used to say that truth has a weight to it. Lies are light. They float away if you're not holding on to them. But truth is heavy. It sinks deep and stays put. That's why it always comes back up eventually. Her smile was sad. Took longer than it should have. But here we are. Darren watched her walk slowly back toward the older section of the cemetery, her figure growing smaller among the headstones. In his hand, the key felt like both a gift and a burden. He looked down at Augustus Kane's grave, a devoted lawman who tried to do the right thing and paid with his life. Darren had been a contractor, not a detective or a crusader. He'd come to Ridgewood just to rebuild a house and start over. But now he held evidence that could vindicate a dead man and expose a conspiracy that had corrupted this town for decades. The question was whether he had the courage to see it through. He thought about the threatening phone call, the break-ins, the cold stares from townspeople. He thought about Lawrence Pritchard, whose personal effects he'd found in that hidden room, and wondered what had really happened to the man. Then he thought about those 6 people who disappeared. Transients, drifters, people whose absence wouldn't be noticed. People who'd trusted the wrong town, walked into the wrong situation, and vanished without a trace. They deserved better than to be forgotten. Darren tucked the key into his pocket and headed back to his truck. Crestview was 30 miles away. He could be there and back before dark, and then he'd know exactly what Augustus Kane had hidden away, and whether it was enough to bring 40 years of lies crashing down. As he drove through the cemetery gates, he noticed a car parked on the street, engine idling. The driver's face was partially obscured by sunglasses, but Darren recognized Vernon from the hardware store. The older man watched him pass, expression unreadable, and Darren wondered how much of his conversation with Phyllis had been observed. It didn't matter anymore. He was committed now. Whatever came next, he'd face it head on. For the first time since his divorce, since losing his business, since everything had fallen apart, Darren felt something stir in his chest. Not quite hope, it was too soon for that, but purpose, direction, the sense that maybe his life could mean something again. He pressed the accelerator and headed toward Crestview, toward whatever secrets Augustus Kaew had preserved, toward the truth that someone had killed to bury. The drive to Crestview took Darren through countryside that gradually opened up, rolling farmland, giving way to slightly larger towns, more traffic, the sense of a world beyond Ridgewood's insular borders. He kept checking his rearview mirror, half expecting to see Vernon's car following, but the road behind him remained clear. Crestview was larger than Ridgewood, with actual stoplights and chain restaurants at the highway exits. The First National Bank sat on a corner downtown, a solid brick building that looked like it had been there since the Depression. Darren parked and sat for a moment, the key heavy in his pocket, wondering what he was about to find. Inside, the bank was quiet and cool, with that particular hush that financial institutions cultivate. An elderly manager with reading glasses on a chain approached when Darren explained his purpose. The man examined the key, checked a ledger, and made a brief phone call, presumably to Phyllis Kaew for authorization. Box 147, the manager confirmed. "Follow me, please." They descended to the vault level, where rows of safety deposit boxes lined the walls in gleaming metal. The manager used his master key in combination with Darren's key, and the box slid free. He carried it to a private room, set it on the table, and withdrew discreetly. Darren lifted the lid. Inside were manila folders, their edges yellowed with age. A cassette tape in a clear plastic case, labeled in neat handwriting, "Insurance A. Kaew." Beneath those, handwritten notes on legal pads. The ink faded but still legible. He started with the folders. The first contained photocopies of the ledger pages he'd seen in the basement, but these had annotations in the margins. Augustus Kaew's handwriting identified the initials. P.W. was Preston Wolfe Sr., T.N. was Theodore Nash Sr., L.P. was Lawrence Pritchard, and A.K., Augustus had circled that one heavily, was himself, though he'd added a note, "False entry. Never accepted payment." "They're setting me up." The second folder held witness statements typed on official police forms. 3 different people had reported seeing suspicious activity at the Pritchard house, vehicles arriving late at night, sounds from the basement, people who went in but weren't seen leaving. All 3 witnesses were noted as deceased in Kaew's handwriting, with dates that followed shortly after their statements. One had died in a car accident, another from a fall, the third from a sudden heart attack, despite being only 42 years old. The third folder contained photographs Kaew had taken himself, surveillance shots of the Pritchard house. Vehicles with license plates visible, men loading boxes into trucks. Dates and times noted on each photo. Some showed the interior of what appeared to be tunnels, old brick passages with modern equipment set up for storage and transport. But it was the cassette tape that held Darren's attention. The bank had an old player in the room, probably for exactly this purpose, allowing people to review old recordings. He inserted the tape and pressed play, static, then Augustus Kaew's voice. "Herman clear. My name is Sheriff Augustus Kaew. Today is October 15th, 1978. I'm recording this as insurance because I believe my life may be in danger." Darren leaned forward, listening intently as the dead man's testimony unfolded. Kaew described discovering the pattern of disappearances, his growing suspicion of fellow officers, his covert investigation. He detailed the smuggling operation, stolen goods moving through the rural routes, using the old mining tunnels that honeycombed the area beneath Ridgewood. The Pritchard house served as the central hub, with 5 other properties connected underground. "The operation is sophisticated," Kaew's voice continued. "Town officials are complicit. Mayor Wolfe, Police Chief Nash, 3 council members whose names I've documented. They take cuts in exchange for protection. Anyone who notices too much, who asks too many questions, disappears. The transients, the drifters, they're not random victims. They're people who stumbled onto something who needed to be silenced. Kane's voice tightened with emotion. I confronted Lawrence Pritchard 2 days ago. He denied everything at first, then tried to buy my silence. When I refused, he threatened my family, said accidents happen, that I should think about my wife and son. I told him I'd already turned the evidence over to state authorities. That was a lie. I'm holding it until I can guarantee my family's safety. There was a pause, the hiss of tape running. Then Kane spoke again, quieter now. If you're hearing this, I'm probably dead. They've gotten to me before I could get the evidence to the right people. Don't let them bury the truth with me. These men, Wolf, Nash, Pritchard, the others, they've killed at least 6 people that I can prove. Probably more. They've corrupted this town from the top down. Someone needs to stop them. The recording clicked off. Darren sat in the silence that followed, feeling the weight of what he'd just heard. This wasn't speculation or theory. This was a law enforcement officer's testimony, recorded weeks before his death, naming names and detailing crimes. This was evidence that could destroy lives, and not just the old men who'd committed the original sins. Their children now held power in Ridgewood, Mayor Preston Wolf Jr., Police Chief Theodore Nash Jr. If their fathers' crimes became public, the scandal would end their careers, possibly bring criminal charges for cover-up or obstruction. No wonder someone had threatened Darren. No wonder they'd broken into his house. These weren't just old secrets. They were active threats to people who currently held power and wealth. Darren made copies of everything using the bank's equipment, then returned the originals to the box. Evidence this important needed to be preserved and protected. He asked the manager for permission to keep the box rented under Phyllis Kane's name, with himself as an authorized party. The manager agreed readily enough. On the drive back to Ridgewood, Darren's mind raced. He had everything he needed now: documents, photographs, eyewitness testimony from a deceased officer. Enough to take to state authorities, maybe even federal investigators. This went beyond small-town corruption. This was organized crime, spanning decades. But as Ridgewood came into view, with its church steeple and water tower rising above the trees, Darren felt the weight of what he was about to unleash. This town had lived with these lies for 40 years. Families had built their lives and reputations on foundations of blood and stolen money. Exposing the truth would tear the community apart. He stopped at Beatrice's diner, needing coffee and a moment to think. The lunch crowd had thinned, just a few people scattered among the booths. Beatrice brought coffee without being asked and slid into the seat across from him. "You look troubled," she said quietly. "Just thinking through some things." She glanced around, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear. "I know what you're doing." "The whole town knows by now." Vernon made sure of that. "You're asking questions about the past, about Lawrence Pritchard." Darren met her eyes. "Did you know him?" "I knew him. And I knew Augustus Kane." She folded her hands on the table. "My late husband was part of it. The smuggling operation. He never told me details, but I wasn't blind. Money came in that he couldn't explain. He'd leave at odd hours. And when those people went missing, he'd come home shaking." This admission caught Darren off guard. He was one of the conspirators? He was weak and greedy and scared. All three. Her voice held old pain. On his deathbed 10 years ago, he confessed everything. Made me promise never to tell. Said it would only bring pain to our family. She looked at Darren steadily. "I kept that promise until now. Why tell me?" "Because someone needs to. Because what they did was wrong, and pretending it didn't happen doesn't make it right." She paused. "And because Mayor Wolf still uses those tunnels. I've seen his car at the old mill at night. Lights in windows that should be dark. I don't know what he's moving now, but whatever your investigation stirs up, it's not just ancient history." That evening, Darren sat in the basement with all the evidence spread before him. The documents from Kane's safety deposit box, the materials from the hidden room, his own notes and photographs. He was trying to organize everything chronologically, to build a timeline that would be clear and irrefutable when he took it to the authorities. Rusty lay nearby, but his attention kept drifting to the hidden room. The dog would lift his head periodically, ears pricked forward, staring at the opening Darren had made in the false wall. After the third time, Darren looked up from his work. "What is it, boy?" Rusty stood and walked to the opening, sniffing at the floor. He began pawing at a particular spot near the back corner, whining softly. Darren grabbed his flashlight and joined the dog. At first, he saw nothing unusual, just the old concrete floor, cracked and stained with age. But Rusty kept digging, his claws scraping insistently. Darren knelt and examined the area more carefully. The concrete here did look different. The color was slightly lighter, the texture not quite matching the surrounding floor. And now that, he studied it. He could see the faint outline of a patch, roughly 3 feet by 6 feet, the dimensions making his stomach turn cold. He'd done enough construction to recognize a concrete pour that didn't match the original foundation. This section had been added later, poured over something that needed to be hidden. His hands shook slightly as he went to his truck and retrieved a sledgehammer and pry bar. Back in the basement, he positioned himself over the newer concrete and swung. The first blow cracked the surface, the second broke through. By the 10th swing, he'd opened a hole large enough to see what lay beneath. The smell hit him first. Musty earth and decay, though faint after so many years. He shone the flashlight into the cavity and saw fabric disintegrated with time. Beneath it, the unmistakable shape of human remains. Darren sat back hard, the flashlight beam wavering. Lawrence Pritchard hadn't left town. He'd never left this house. He was buried in his own basement, beneath concrete poured by the very men he'd conspired with. The realization reframed everything. The property records showed Pritchard's house going into foreclosure in 1979, sold at auction by the bank. Everyone assumed he'd abandoned it, fled his debts, and disappeared. But he'd been here all along, dead and buried while his conspirators took over his operation. Darren's mind raced through the implications. Augustus Kane had died in October 1978. The ledger's final entries were from that same month. And Pritchard's. Foreclosure happened in early 1979, which meant Pritchard had probably died shortly after Kane. The conspirators had eliminated both men who knew too much, then shut down the operation or moved it elsewhere. He needed to call the police. This was a crime scene, evidence of murder. But which police? Sheriff Briggs seemed honest enough, but could Darren be sure? The original conspiracy had included the police chief. How deep did the corruption run? He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, requesting state police. The dispatcher was professional, asking careful questions. Yes, he'd discovered what appeared to be human remains. No, he hadn't disturbed them beyond the initial excavation. Yes, he would wait at the scene. Then he called Phyllis Kane. She answered on the third ring, her voice thin with age but alert. "Mrs. Kane, it's Darren. I found something. Something important." He explained about the remains, about his growing certainty that Pritchard had never left town. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "They killed him too," she finally said. "After they killed Augustus, they couldn't let either of them talk. I've called the state police. This will become a murder investigation." "Good. Let them dig. Let them find every secret buried in that cursed house." Her voice strengthened. "Augustus died trying to expose these men. Now maybe he'll finally get justice." Within 2 hours, Darren's property was swarming with vehicles. State, police cruisers, a forensics van, an unmarked sedan that held the lead investigator. Lieutenant Maria Cordova was a woman in her mid-40s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She listened to Darren's story, took notes, and asked pointed questions. "You just happened to be digging in your basement and found this?" "My dog kept pawing at that spot. I noticed the concrete was different." Darren met her gaze steadily, "And I'd found some things that made me suspicious about the property's history." "What things?" He showed her the hidden room, the filing cabinet, the documents. Her expression remained neutral, but he could see the calculations happening behind her eyes. This wasn't just a cold case. This was potentially a major corruption investigation. "I'm going to need all of this," she said, gesturing at the evidence, "and I'm going to need a detailed statement from you about how you found it and what you've done with it since." "I understand, but I made copies of everything, for insurance." She smiled thinly. "Smart. Keep them somewhere safe." She paused, studying him. "You've kicked a hornet's nest, Mr. Darren. You understand that?" "I'm beginning to." Sheriff Briggs arrived while the forensics team was setting up lights and equipment in the basement. He looked grim, his jaw tight as he surveyed the scene. When he spotted Darren, he approached with Lieutenant Cordova. "This is your jurisdiction, Sheriff," Cordova said. "But given the age of the case and the potential scope, state police will be taking lead." "I trust that's acceptable?" Briggs nodded slowly. "I've suspected for years that something wasn't right about Ridgewood's history. My predecessor left very incomplete files. If you're here to clean house, you won't get resistance from me." "Your predecessor being Theodore Nash Sr.?" "That's right. He retired the year before I transferred in. Always thought it was convenient timing." Briggs turned to Darren. "I'm sorry you've been through this. Sorry someone threatened you, broke into your home. That stops now. I'll make sure you have protection." The excavation took 2 days. Forensics worked carefully, documenting everything, removing the concrete piece by piece. They found skeletal remains, male, with dental records that eventually confirmed what Darren already knew. Lawrence Pritchard, dead approximately 45 years, cause of death blunt force trauma to the skull. But that wasn't all they found. Buried with Pritchard was his wallet, containing his driver's license and credit cards, and tucked inside the wallet was a folded piece of paper, a hand-drawn map showing the tunnel network beneath Ridgewood in detail. 6 properties connected underground, with notes about access points and storage locations, the original planning document for their smuggling operation. Lieutenant Cordova studied the map with intense focus. "This changes the scope significantly. If these tunnels still exist, we need to search every location marked here." By the end of the week, the story had spread throughout Ridgewood like wildfire. The town was in shock. News vans from regional stations parked on Main Street. Reporters interviewed anyone willing to talk. The discovery of Pritchard's body meant this wasn't just old rumors or forgotten history. This was an active murder investigation. Mayor Preston Wolfe Jr. held a press conference, his face carefully composed. "This is a tragedy, and we will cooperate fully with the investigation. Whatever happened decades ago, it has no bearing on current town leadership." But Darren could see the fear behind the mayor's eyes, the careful phrasing, the legal distance being established. Wolfe knew what was coming. That night, someone threw a brick through Darren's front window. A note was attached, the message scrawled in angry capitals, "Drop it or join Pritchard." Darren stood in his living room, glass crunching under his boots, and felt strangely calm. They were scared now. Good. They should be, because he wasn't stopping. Until every secret was exposed, every crime answered for, every victim remembered. Phyllis Kane came to stay with him that night, her own house having been ransacked in what the police called an attempted burglary. She sat in his kitchen, a cup of tea cooling in her hands, tears running silently down her weathered cheeks. 40 years, she whispered. 40 years I waited. Darren reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "It's not over yet, but we're going to finish what Augustus started." Outside, a state police cruiser sat in his driveway, lights off, but presence clear. Protection detail, Cordova had called it. Insurance that Darren would survive long enough to see this through. In the basement, the excavation site was sealed with police tape. But the evidence was already in motion. Lab tests being run, databases being searched, old case files being reopened. The machinery of justice, slow but inexorable, grinding toward truth. Darren sat up late that night, Rusty at his feet, and Phyllis sleeping in the spare room. He thought about Lawrence Pritchard, buried in his own basement for 4 decades. About Augustus Kane, pushed downstairs and written off as an accident. About 6 people who'd disappeared without anyone caring enough to truly search for them. Their voices had been silenced, but Darren had found them. And now, finally, someone would listen. The discovery of Pritchard's body changed everything. What had been Darren's private investigation became a coordinated state operation. Federal investigators arrived within days, drawn by the RICO implications of organized crime spanning decades. Darren's house transformed into something between a crime scene and a command center. Lieutenant Cordova established a timeline on a whiteboard in what had been Darren's dining room. 6 disappearances between 1972 and 1978. Augustus Kane's investigation and death in October 1978. Lawrence Pritchard's murder sometime shortly after. The operation shut down or moved, the evidence buried, literally, and forgotten. But Beatrice's observation nagged at Darren. Current activity at the old mill. Mayor Wolf's car seen at odd hours. The possibility that whatever had been shut down 40 years ago had somehow resumed, perhaps on a smaller scale, perhaps with different players. He studied Pritchard's map again, the one found in the dead man's wallet. 6 properties marked. His house was the central hub. The old mill was another node. 3 other locations were marked with initials. A church that had been abandoned decades ago, a warehouse on the edge of town, and a property simply labeled W Estate, Wolf Estate. Had to be. Darren shared this observation with Cordova over coffee one morning. She sat back, considering. If there's current criminal activity, we need evidence beyond 40-year-old documents, she said. We need to catch them in the act. The mill, Darren said. Beatrice said she's seen lights there at night. If they're still using the tunnels, that would be an access point. Investigating that requires warrants, proper procedure. We can't just walk in. But I could. Darren kept his voice level. I'm a civilian. If I happen to be exploring an abandoned building and see something suspicious, that's different from an officer conducting a search. Cordova's expression hardened. Absolutely not. You're a witness in a murder investigation, possibly a target. I can't sanction you putting yourself in danger. I'm not asking for sanction. I'm telling you what I'm going to do. He met her gaze. These people killed 2 men to keep their secrets. They've threatened me, broken into my home, tried to intimidate me into leaving. I'm not going to sit here and wait while they destroy evidence or disappear. If something happens to you, then you'll have probable cause for a raid. He stood. I'm going tonight. With or without your knowledge. He walked away before she could respond, knowing she couldn't officially approve, but hoping she'd be smart enough to have backup ready if things went wrong. That afternoon, Darren prepared carefully. He charged his phone fully, made sure the camera worked. He told Phyllis his plan. She tried to talk him out of it, but he could see the steel in her eyes that said she understood. Someone had to do this. Someone had to take the risk. Augustus would have liked you, she said softly as he prepared to leave. You have his sense of what's right mattering more than what's safe. I'm not that brave. I'm just tired of being pushed around. That's the same thing sometimes. As evening fell, Darren left Rusty with Phyllis and drove toward the mill. The old building sat on the outskirts of town, where industry had once thrived before the mines closed and the economy shifted. 3 stories of brick and broken windows, surrounded by overgrown lots and rusted chain-link fence. He parked a quarter-mile away and approached on foot, using the failing light and old equipment as cover. The mill looked abandoned, as it had for years. But as he circled it, he saw what Beatrice had mentioned, fresh tire tracks in the dirt, leading to a bay door on the north side. And through a crack in the boards covering a first-floor window, he saw the faint glow of artificial light. His pulse quickened. Someone was here. He found an access point where the chain link had been cut and peeled back, creating an opening just large enough to slip through. Inside the fence line, he moved carefully, testing each step to avoid debris that might make noise. The bay door was secured with a heavy padlock, but a smaller service entrance beside it stood slightly ajar. Darren eased it open and stepped inside. The mill's interior was vast and dark, filled with the hulking shapes of old machinery. But voices carried from somewhere deeper in the building. Male voices, low and conversational. He moved toward them, using his phone to record video as he went. The voices led him to a freight elevator shaft. The elevator itself was gone, but he could see light spilling up from below. And when he leaned over the edge, he heard the voices more clearly. "Last shipment clears out tonight, then we shut it down for good. This investigation's too close. Your father kept it running 30 years before anyone noticed. We've only been back at it for 5. My father had better control of the police. Sheriff Briggs isn't like Nash was." Darren's hands shook as he held the phone recording. That was Mayor Wolf's voice, he was certain of it. And the second voice. He'd heard it before, but couldn't quite place it. He leaned further over the edge, trying to see. Below, in what must have been the basement level, he saw 3 men loading cardboard boxes into the back of a van. The boxes bore no markings, but their careful handling suggested valuable contents. What about the outsider? The third man asked, and Darren recognized Vernon's gravelly tone. "He's not backing off. We handle it like we handled the others," Wolf said coldly. "Make it look like an accident. Old house, faulty wiring, tragic fire. Problem solved. You really think we can get away with that now? With state police watching him? We don't have a choice. He knows too much. And that old woman, Kane's widow, she's been talking. They both need to go." Darren's phone buzzed, a text message lighting up the screen. In the silence of the mill, the sound seemed impossibly loud. The men below froze. What was that? Vernon's voice sharp with alarm. "Someone's up there." Wolf's tone went from cold to deadly. "Check it out now." Darren ran. Footsteps pounded behind him as Darren sprinted through the mill's darkened interior. He dodged around old machinery, his phone clutched tight in one hand, the recording still active. Behind him, flashlight beams cut through the darkness, and voices shouted coordinates. "North side." "He's heading for the exit." Darren altered course, diving through a doorway into what had once been an office area. Desks and filing cabinets created a maze of obstacles. He heard his pursuers split up, trying to cut him off from multiple angles. His breath came in ragged gasps, and sweat stung his eyes despite the cold air. His construction experience saved him. He recognized the building's structure, knew that old mills like this had loading docks on multiple levels. He found a stairwell and descended 2 floors, his boots clanging on metal stairs. The sound echoed through the empty building, announcing his position to anyone listening. He emerged into a vast room filled with rusted equipment, massive looms that had once woven fabric, now silent monuments to dead industry. The loading dock was ahead, a large opening where trucks had once backed in to receive goods. Moonlight spilled through the gap, offering a path to freedom. He was 10 feet from the opening when Vernon appeared from behind a support beam, blocking his path. The older man was breathing hard, his face flushed with exertion and anger. In the dim light filtering from outside, Darren could see the conflict in Vernon's eyes, fear, desperation, and something that might have been regret. "You should have left when you had the chance," Vernon said, pulling a wrench from his belt. Not a weapon exactly, but it could serve as one. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped it. None of this had to happen. "I've got everything recorded," Darren said, holding up his phone so Vernon could see the screen still glowing with the active recording. "Your voice, Wolf's voice, all of it. You threatening me just makes it worse." Vernon's expression crumpled. For a moment, he looked like what he truly was, an old man caught in something far beyond his control. "Drowning in choices made from desperation rather than malice. Then we'll take the phone," Vernon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Nobody will believe you without it. You know that's not true. I've made copies, sent files to people you can't reach." Darren was lying, but Vernon didn't need to know that. "This is over. Let me go, and maybe they'll show you mercy for not making it worse." Vernon's jaw worked, his knuckles white around the wrench. Behind them, Darren heard the others approaching, footsteps echoing through the cavernous space, flashlights sweeping closer. Time was running out. Darren feinted left, then broke right, using a move he'd learned from years of youth sports. Vernon lunged but missed, his reaction slowed by age and hesitation. Darren was, through the loading dock opening, dropping 8 feet to the ground below. He landed hard on packed earth, his ankle twisting beneath him. Pain shot up his leg, sharp and immediate. He stumbled, nearly fell, but adrenaline overrode the injury and kept him moving. Behind him, he heard Vernon shouting, the words lost in the rush of blood in his ears. His truck was a quarter-mile away. He ran through the overgrown lot, weaving between rusted equipment and piles of scrap metal. The ankle screamed protest with every step, but he pushed through it. Behind him, he heard Vernon shouting to the others, then the sound of a vehicle starting. A diesel engine roaring to life, headlights blazed to life, sweeping across the lot like searchlights. They found him, pinned him in their glare. The truck roared toward him, closing the distance fast. Darren pushed harder, his lungs burning, his injured ankle threatening to buckle with each impact. He reached the fence line and dove through the gap in the chain link, just as the pursuing truck skidded to a stop behind him, its brakes squealing. He scrambled up and kept running, now on the access road that led back toward town. His own truck was ahead, silhouetted against the night sky, and he had his keys ready in his trembling hand. He was fumbling with the door lock, his fingers clumsy with adrenaline and fear, when the other truck rounded the corner, accelerating hard. Darren threw himself into the driver's seat, jammed the key into the ignition, and the engine caught on the first try, a small mercy. He peeled out just as the pursuing vehicle closed in. It tried to ram him, its front bumper catching his rear quarter panel with a shriek of metal on metal. The impact sent Darren's truck fishtailing, the rear end sliding across the gravel. He corrected, fighting the wheel, and accelerated down the dark road. The injured ankle made it difficult to work the pedals smoothly, each press of the gas or brake sending fresh waves of pain up his leg. But fear and determination kept him focused. Behind him, the pursuit truck matched his speed, its headlights filling his rearview mirror with blinding light. The driver, Wolf, he was certain now, attempted another ram, trying to force him off the road and into the deep ditch that ran alongside. Darren swerved, using every defensive driving technique he'd ever learned. His truck bounced over rough patches, the suspension groaning, but he kept it on the pavement. He grabbed his phone with one hand while steering with the other, nearly dropping it twice before getting a grip. He dialed 911, praying the call would go through. "This is Darren from the Pritchard House investigation," he said when the dispatcher answered, his voice shaking. "I'm being pursued on Route 9, heading toward Ridgewood. They're trying to run me off the road. I have evidence of current criminal activity, recorded confessions." The dispatcher's voice was professionally calm, an anchor of sanity in the chaos. "Units are being dispatched to your location. Can you make it to the sheriff's station?" "I'm trying." Another impact from behind jolted his truck, harder this time. The phone flew from his hand, clattering somewhere in the passenger footwell. "They're forcing me off." He dropped the phone to grab the wheel with both hands as the pursuing vehicle made a final, violent attempt to send him into the ditch. Darren fought the skid, his truck's tires screaming in protest, the steering wheel jerking in his hands. For a terrible moment he felt the vehicle tipping, the right side wheels lifting off the pavement. Then somehow, through skill or luck or sheer stubbornness, he brought it back down, all four wheels gripping the road again. His heart hammered so hard he could feel it in his throat. Ahead, blue and red lights pierced the darkness, multiple vehicles forming a roadblock across both lanes. Sheriff Briggs and state police, positioned with tactical precision. Darren's heart leaped with relief as he slowed, guiding his battered truck to a stop just short of the barricade. The vehicle behind him saw the roadblock and hit the brakes hard, trying to reverse. But more police units had blocked the rear escape route, closing the trap. Within seconds, 3 men were being pulled from the truck at gunpoint: Mayor Preston Wolfe Jr., Police Chief Theodore Nash Jr., and Vernon, who went without resistance. His face empty of everything but exhaustion and relief. Darren sat in his truck, hands still gripping the wheel, unable to let go. His whole body shook with aftershock, adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. His ankle throbbed. His hands were cramped from clutching the steering wheel. But he was alive. Lieutenant Cordova approached his window, her expression a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "You're an idiot," she said, but her tone held something softer beneath the rebuke. A brave idiot, but an idiot nonetheless. Please tell me you got something useful before you decided to play action hero. He handed her the phone with trembling hands. Full confession. Threats against me and Phyllis Kane. Admission of the current operation. Everything you need. She took the phone, and as she reviewed the recording, a smile broke across her face, fierce and satisfied. Then it's over. We've got them. The arrests sent shockwaves through Ridgewood. Within 24 hours, federal agents had expanded the investigation, executing search warrants on the properties marked on Pritchard's map. The tunnel system was real, extensive, and had indeed been reactivated. They found evidence of smuggled goods, prescription medications, untaxed cigarettes, stolen electronics, a smaller operation than the original but profitable nonetheless. The tunnels themselves were remarkable. Brick-lined passages dating back to the 1800s, when mining operations had required underground transport routes. Most people in Ridgewood had forgotten they existed, but the conspirators had maintained them carefully, even installing modern lighting and ventilation in key sections. Federal engineers spent days mapping the full network, discovering connections that extended beyond the 6 properties on Pritchard's map. Vernon broke first, offering testimony in exchange for a reduced sentence. Sitting across from investigators in a windowless room, he'd looked diminished, an old man who'd made terrible choices and now faced their consequences. He'd been recruited 5 years earlier when financial troubles made him vulnerable. The hardware store was struggling, competition from big-box retailers in neighboring towns cutting into his margins. Bills piled up, his retirement savings evaporated. Mayor Wolf had approached him with an offer, help with the operation, use his hardware store as a front for certain transactions, and he'd see enough money to save his business. Vernon had agreed, telling himself it wasn't hurting anyone, that it was just goods, not people like before. He'd convinced himself he could keep his hands clean, that he was just providing storage space and looking the other way. I didn't know about the murders, Vernon told investigators, his voice breaking as tears ran down his weathered face. Not until Darren started asking questions. Then Wolf told me what they'd done, what his father and the others had done to Pritchard and Sheriff Kane. Said if anyone found out, we'd all go down together. Said I was complicit now, that I'd helped cover it up by staying silent. He wiped his eyes with shaking hands. I was trapped. Every day I thought about going to the police, but I was terrified and ashamed, so ashamed. His testimony provided crucial details about the current operation, how it worked, who was involved, where money was hidden. He described meetings at the mill, shipments arriving late at night, the careful system they'd developed to avoid detection. His cooperation would shave years off his sentence, but he'd still go to prison. He'd still lose his business, his reputation, everything he'd tried to protect. Police Chief Nash refused to talk initially, sitting stone-faced through interrogations with his lawyer whispering caution. But the evidence overwhelmed him. Boxes of stolen goods had been found in his garage during the search. Financial records showed unexplained deposits totaling over $200,000 across 5 years. Testimony from Vernon placed him at the mill operation repeatedly, documenting his active participation. When forensic accountants traced specific shipments to cases Nash had deliberately mishandled as chief of police, burglaries uninvestigated, suspicious activities unreported, the scope of his corruption became undeniable. His lawyer eventually negotiated a plea agreement in exchange for full cooperation, though Nash never showed the remorse that Vernon displayed. He remained bitter, insisting he'd been no worse than his father, that the town had always operated this way. Mayor Wolf held out longest, maintaining innocence even as the case against him solidified. He hired expensive lawyers from the city, held press conferences proclaiming his integrity, suggested he was being scapegoated for sins committed by previous generations. But the recording on Darren's phone was damning, his own voice plotting murder, admitting to the current operation, acknowledging his father's crimes without apparent moral conflict. When forensic accountants traced money from the smuggling operation to accounts in his name, accounts He tried to hide through shell corporations and offshore transfers. His defense collapsed. The lawyers negotiated quietly, trying to minimize the sentence, but Wolf would spend the next 2 decades in prison. His political career, his family legacy, his carefully constructed image, all of it reduced to ashes. The trials wouldn't happen for months, the legal process grinding slowly forward, but the outcome was inevitable. 12 arrests total, charges ranging from smuggling to conspiracy to commit murder. The web of corruption that had protected the original conspirators was being systematically dismantled, thread by thread. But the process was painful for Ridgewood. Town meetings became battlegrounds where neighbors who'd known each other for decades found themselves on opposite sides. Some residents defended the arrested men, insisting they were good people who'd made mistakes, that destroying them wouldn't undo the past. Others demanded accountability, angry that corruption had festered for so long, furious that their trust had been so thoroughly betrayed. Families divided over dinner tables. Long friendships ended over fundamental disagreements about justice and loyalty. The town that had seemed so unified revealed deep fractures between those who valued truth over comfort and those who believed some things were better left buried. Phyllis Kane attended a community meeting 2 weeks after the arrests. The high school gymnasium was packed, every seat filled and people standing along the walls. The air was thick with tension and competing emotions. She'd asked for time to speak, and though some had objected, the moderator had granted her request. She stood before the crowd in a simple dress, her silver hair neatly arranged, her posture straight despite her 83 years. For a moment, she just looked at them, the people she'd lived among for half a century, many of whom had avoided her eyes for 40 years. "I've lived here 50 years, she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Raised my son here, buried my husband here. For 40 years, I kept silent about what happened to Augustus because I was afraid. Afraid for my family, afraid of being alone, afraid no one would believe me, afraid that speaking up would cost me everything I had left." She paused, and the room was utterly silent. That silence didn't protect anyone. It just let the lies grow deeper roots. It let the people who killed my husband live comfortable lives, raise families, hold positions of authority. It let them do it again, recruit new people, corrupt a new generation, perpetuate the same crimes under a different name. Some people looked away, uncomfortable. Others nodded, tears in their eyes. What happened to my husband was murder. What happened to Lawrence Pritchard was murder. 6 people disappeared from this area, and no one cared enough to truly search for them because they were outsiders, people without families or connections. People we decided didn't matter. Her voice strengthened, carrying to every corner of the gymnasium. "We can't undo those crimes, but we can acknowledge them. We can stop protecting the people who committed them just because they're our neighbors or our leaders or our family members. We can choose truth over convenience." She sat down to scattered applause that gradually grew. Though some sections of the gymnasium remained silent, arms crossed, faces set in disapproval, the vote that followed was narrow, but it passed. Ridgewood would establish a memorial for the victims of the conspiracy. Their names would be carved in stone, placed in the town square, a permanent acknowledgement of what had been done and who had suffered. The decision meant something. An official recognition that the town bore responsibility, that remembering was more important than forgetting. Darren attended the ceremony when the memorial was dedicated 3 months later. It was a cold morning in early spring, the sky grey, but the air holding promise of warmer days ahead. Simple granite, elegant lettering, listing the 6 missing people by name, names researchers had painstakingly verified through old records and DNA analysis of remains found. During the tunnel excavation, 2 more bodies had been discovered during the systematic search, giving families closure after decades of wondering. Relatives had traveled from across the country to attend the dedication, some elderly themselves now, others middle-aged children who'd grown up not knowing what happened to a missing parent or sibling. Augustus Kane's name was there too, with a notation, sheriff, died seeking justice. And Lawrence Pritchard's, because despite his crimes he'd also been murdered. His life taken by men who'd claimed to be his partners. Phyllis Kane stood beside Darren as the mayor pro tem, a woman named Sandra Briggs. The sheriff's sister gave a speech about remembering the past to build a better future. When it ended, Phyllis placed flowers at the memorial's base, her hand trembling, but her face peaceful. "Thank you," she said to Darren quietly, "for finishing what Augustus started. I just found what was already there." "No," she shook her head firmly. "You had the courage to look when everyone else had decided it was easier not to. That matters more than you know." 6 months after the arrests, Darren stood on his finished porch and surveyed what he'd built. The house no longer looked cursed or abandoned. Fresh paint gleamed white in the afternoon sun, each board straight and true. New shingles covered the roof in precise overlapping rows. Windows sparkled, their frames solid and square, no longer rattling in their casings when the wind blew. The yard had been cleared and planted, flowers blooming along the walkway he'd laid with his own hands, purple coneflowers and black-eyed Susans, native plants that would thrive in this soil. It was a home now. His home, not just a refuge or a last resort, but a place he'd chosen to stay even when he could have left. Rusty lay in a patch of sunlight, greying muzzle resting on his paws, content in the way only old dogs can be. The shepherd had been his constant companion through everything, the discovery, the threats, the investigation, the long nights of doubt and fear. Now he deserved peace, and so did Darren. The trials had concluded the week before. The courtroom had been packed for the final verdicts, media from 3 states covering what had become a regional scandal. Guilty verdicts on all major counts. Mayor Wolf received 20 years for conspiracy, racketeering, and attempted murder. Police Chief Nash got 15 years for similar charges, plus obstruction of justice. Vernon, having cooperated fully and shown genuine remorse, received 5 years with eligibility for parole after 3. The others received sentences ranging between those poles. Justice meted out according to their involvement and willingness to testify. The judge's words had been memorable. "This court acknowledges that some of these crimes occurred before the defendants were born, committed by their fathers and grandfathers. But these men chose to perpetuate that corruption, to profit from it, and to threaten violence against anyone who might expose it. They bear full responsibility for their own choices. Ridgewood was different now. The corruption that had poisoned it for decades was being excised slowly but thoroughly. Sheriff Briggs had been elected to a full term by a wide margin, campaigning on transparency and accountability. His platform was simple: equal justice under law, regardless of family name or social standing. The message had resonated. The town council had been entirely replaced in a special election. 5 new members, including 2 who'd moved to Ridgewood within the past decade, brought fresh perspectives unburdened by old loyalties. They'd implemented ethics rules, public disclosure requirements, and citizen oversight committees. Government meetings were now recorded and posted online. The days of decisions made in backrooms were over, or at least much more difficult to maintain. New businesses were opening, attracted by lower property values, and a community determined to rebuild its reputation. A coffee shop had opened on Main Street, run by a young couple from the city seeking small-town life. A bookstore followed, then an art gallery. Tourism was even picking up. People came to see the tunnel system, now being preserved as a historical site, with educational programs about both the mining history and the darker chapters that followed. Beatrice still ran her diner, and she'd become something of a local hero for her role in exposing the current operation. She'd testified at the trials, describing what her late husband had confessed and what she'd observed at the mill. The courage it took to speak against her own family's legacy had earned her respect, even from those who'd initially resented the investigation. Her business had actually improved, the diner becoming a gathering place for the community's healing conversations. She visited Darren's porch that afternoon, bringing pie as she often did. It had become a weekly ritual between them. "Looks good," she said. settling into one of the rocking chairs he'd built from lumber, salvaged from the old barn out back. Hard to believe this was the house everyone avoided. Hard to believe I almost gave up on it. Darren accepted the pie gratefully, apple still warm from her oven, the crust golden and flaky. There were nights I thought about just walking away, packing up Rusty and driving until I found somewhere that didn't come with so much weight. But you didn't. That's what matters. She rocked gently, her gaze distant. My husband made terrible choices. Knowing that doesn't erase the years we had together, the good moments, the life we built. But it changes how I remember them. I'm still working through that. Probably will be for the rest of my life. Takes time, Darren said, understanding in a way he hadn't 6 months ago. His own past looked different now, too. The business failure, the divorce, the desperate flight to this town. All of it had led him here, to this porch, to this moment of hard-won peace. It does, she smiled, the expression softening the lines in her face. But time we've got? And that's more than some people received. They sat in comfortable silence, rocking slowly, watching the street where an occasional car passed and neighbors waved. This was community, not the false unity of shared secrets, but the harder work of building trust through honesty. Phyllis Kane had moved into a senior living community in Crestview, closer to medical care and amenities she needed at her age. But more importantly, closer to her son, who'd finally returned for a visit after learning the truth about his father's death. That visit had stretched into weeks, father and son reconnecting after years of distance. Phyllis called Darren weekly, checking on him, sharing memories of Augustus, speaking freely now about things she'd kept locked away for 40 years. Augustus would have liked what you've done with the place, she'd told him during their last call, making something good out of all that darkness. He always said that was the best revenge against evil, not matching it with more darkness, but flooding it with light. The basement had been completely renovated. The hidden room was gone, sealed up properly, and converted to normal storage space. The area where Pritchard had been buried was now shelving for tools and supplies, the concrete smooth and level. Darren had exorcised the ghosts, replacing them with the mundane and ordinary, turning a place of secrets into something useful and benign. He'd kept one reminder, though, Augustus Kane's badge, which Phyllis had given him at the memorial dedication. It sat in a frame on his mantel, alongside a photograph of the old sheriff in uniform. Not as a trophy, but as a reminder of what integrity costs and why it matters. A car pulled into his driveway, a young couple he recognized from town. They approached tentatively, the way people do when they're not sure of their welcome. "Mr. Darren." "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said. She was maybe 30, with kind eyes and an earnest expression. "We're thinking about buying the house next door, the old Henderson place. We heard it needs work, and someone at the hardware store said you might have advice about renovation." Darren smiled, setting down his coffee. "Happy to help. Let me grab my keys and we can walk over there together." As they toured the neighboring property, pointing out structural issues and discussing possibilities, explaining which problems were cosmetic and which required immediate attention, Darren realized something had shifted fundamentally. He wasn't the outsider anymore, the man everyone whispered about and avoided. He was part of the community now, someone people sought out for guidance, someone trusted. The young couple asked intelligent questions, took notes, and seemed genuinely excited about the project despite its scope. They reminded him of himself 6 months ago, hopeful, determined, ready to build something worth having. "The house has good bones," Darren told them, echoing words he'd thought about his own property. "It'll take work, but it can be beautiful again. Just needs someone willing to see past what it is to what it could be, like yours," the woman said. "Everyone says your place was hopeless, but look at it now." "Nothing's hopeless," Darren said. "Just takes patience and the willingness to do the work." They thanked him profusely, promising to call when they made their decision. As they drove away, Darren returned to his porch, where Beatrice was still rocking, having helped herself to a slice of the pie she'd brought. "You're good at this," she observed. "Helping people, building things. Maybe you've found your calling. Maybe I have." He settled back into his chair, watching the sun sink lower toward the horizon. Never thought I'd end up here doing this. But life has a way of taking you where you need to go, even if it's not where you planned. That evening, as the sun set over Ridgewood, Darren sat on his porch with Rusty and watched the sky turn gold and purple and finally deep blue. He thought about the journey that had brought him here, the divorce that had shattered his confidence, the business failure that had destroyed his financial security, the desperate purchase of a house nobody wanted because he'd had nowhere else to turn. Every loss had led him to this moment, to this place where he'd found something he hadn't expected: purpose. Not just survival or escape, but a reason to wake up each morning that went beyond himself. The house wasn't cursed. It never had been. It had just been waiting for someone brave enough to uncover its secrets and strong enough to bear the weight of truth. Someone willing to face darkness without becoming consumed by it. Darren had been that person. Not because he was particularly courageous or righteous by nature, but because he'd had nothing left to lose and everything to prove, if only to himself. He'd arrived broken and desperate, and in the process of rebuilding this house, he'd rebuilt himself. Now, with the renovation complete and justice served, he finally had something he hadn't possessed in years, a future worth believing in. Not a perfect future. Ridgewood still had work to do, wounds to heal, trust to rebuild. But a future built on truth rather than lies, on light rather than shadow. Rusty shifted in his sleep, making the contented sound dogs make when they're completely at peace. Darren reached down and scratched behind his ears, grateful for the simple constancy of the dog's presence through everything. The porch light came on automatically as darkness fell, warm and welcoming. Tomorrow, he'd start helping the young couple with their renovation plans. Next week, the Historical Society wanted to interview him about the house's history for their archive. The month after that, he'd been asked to speak at a community forum about restoration and renewal, both of buildings and of towns. Life was moving forward, not running away anymore, but moving toward something. And that made all the difference. Darren closed his eyes and breathed deeply, the evening air cool and clean. He was home, finally, truly home.